The air in my parents' kitchen always smelled of lingering disappointment and oversteeped Earl Grey tea. It was a physical weight, a humidity of the soul that clung to the floral wallpaper and the cracked linoleum floor. I sat at the small, circular wooden table, the same one where I'd been told my grades were unhigh enough for med school, the same one where they'd sighed over my choice of an arts degree, and the same one where tonight the final gavel was falling. "We're just being realistic, Leo," my father said, his voice grating like sandpaper on a rusted pipe. He didn't look up from the local newspaper, though I knew he'd read the same page 3 times already. "The world isn't a playground. You're 24. You're working a consultancy job that sounds like a fancy word for unemployment. You need to face facts." My mother sat opposite him, methodically folding napkins into sharp, clinical triangles. "He's right, honey. We saw the housing report on the news. Prices are up 20%. Even with our help, which, let's be honest, we can't afford to give right now, you'd never qualify for a mortgage. You'll never afford a house, Leo. Not in this lifetime." She reached across the table, her hand cold and dry, squeezing mine in a gesture that was supposed to be comforting but felt like a shackle. "Renting is fine. There's no shame in a managed apartment. It's for the best. It stops you from dreaming about things that will only break your heart." I looked at them, 2 people who had spent their lives playing it safe, staying in the same gray town, working the same gray jobs, and slowly turning gray themselves. They weren't trying to be cruel. They truly believed they were protecting me from the agony of ambition. But as I looked at the scarred wood of the table between us, something inside me didn't break. It forged. It turned from brittle glass into tempered steel. "I understand," I said quietly. I didn't argue. I didn't show them the blueprints on my phone or the spreadsheets in my brain. I just stood up, rinsed my mug, and walked out into the rain. The ghost years, for the next 5 years, I became a phantom. To my parents, I was the son who made do. I moved into a studio apartment that was essentially a glorified closet above a laundromat. The walls vibrated with the spin cycle of industrial washers, and the air always smelled of synthetic lavender and damp heat. Every Sunday, I went to their house for dinner. It was a ritual of reinforced mediocrity. "Still at that tech firm?" My father would ask, chewing his pot roast. "Are they giving you a 401k yet, or are you still freelancing your way to poverty?" "It's stable, Dad," I'd lie. In reality, I wasn't just working at a tech firm. I have founded a niche algorithmic trading platform that specialized in real estate micro-investments. While they thought I was playing on computers, I was building a digital empire. I lived on ramen, protein shakes, and the sheer, unadulterated spite of their low expectations. I didn't buy a new car when my old sedan started throwing blue smoke. I didn't go on vacations. I didn't buy designer clothes. I wore the same 3 black hoodies until they were charcoal gray. Every cent I earned was funneled into a high-yield portfolio. I wasn't just saving for a house, I was saving for a statement. I watched the market like a hawk. I saw the ripples before they became waves. While my father complained about the kids today, wanting handouts, I was leveraging assets they didn't even know existed. The hardest part wasn't the work, it was the silence. It was sitting at that same kitchen table every week, listening to them praise my cousin Marcus for getting a steady job at the post office, while I sat on a net worth that could have bought Marcus his post office and the street it stood on. "You should talk to Marcus," my mother suggested one evening. "He says they're hiring in the sorting room. It's a pension, Leo, a real future. You won't have to worry about the rent increases anymore." "I'll think about it, Mom," I said, my thumb tracing the edge of my wallet, where a black titanium card sat heavy and hidden. The shift happened in the spring of the 5th year. My father's health had taken a dip, nothing fatal, but enough to force an early retirement. Their savings, which they had guarded with such fearful reverence, were suddenly being devoured by medical bills and the rising cost of living in a town that was rapidly gentrifying. Then came the letter. Their landlord, the man who owned the modest ranch-style house they'd rented for 30 years, was selling. He gave them 60 days. I arrived for Sunday dinner to find the house in a state of quiet panic. Boxes were already stacked in the hallway. My mother's porcelain birds, which had sat on the mantel for 3 decades, were wrapped in old newsprint. "We're going to have to move to the estates," my father said. The estates was a euphemism for a bleak block of government-subsidized apartments 3 towns over, near the interstate. His pride was a tattered flag. "The market is a monster, Leo. I told you, it eats people like us. Did you try to buy it?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. He laughed, a bitter, dry sound. "With what? We're 60,000 short of a down payment, even if the bank would look at a retiree. No, we're done here. We're just ... moving on." "It's okay, honey," my mother said, her eyes red-rimmed. "We'll make the apartment nice. You can come visit us there. It's near a bus line, so you won't have to drive that old car of yours so far." I felt a surge of something hot and sharp. Not pity, but a fierce, protective anger. They had spent my whole life trying to shrink my world to fit their fears, and now their own world had shrunk until they were being squeezed out of it. "I have an idea," I said. "Let's have one last dinner, not here, at that new steakhouse downtown." My treat. "Leo, don't be foolish," my father snapped. "You can't afford a place like that. Save your pennies for your own security." "Dad," I said, standing up. "One dinner. For once, just let me pay." The table, the restaurant was all glass, chrome, and the scent of expensive bourbon. My parents looked out of place, clutching their coats like shields. They spent the first 20 minutes looking at the right side of the menu, the prices, and whispering in horror. "We should leave," my mother whispered. $16 for an appetizer? "Leo, this is irresponsible." "Relax, Mom. The Doodles have been paying well lately," I said with a small, cryptic smile. I ordered the best wine on the list. I watched as the tension slowly bled out of my father's shoulders under the influence of a vintage Cabernet he would never have bought for himself. We talked about old times, the few times they actually let themselves be happy without worrying about the cost of joy. As the dessert plates were cleared, a heavy silence descended. The reality of their situation, the boxes, the highway apartment, the end of their era settled back over them. "We have to go sign the papers for the apartment tomorrow," my father said, his voice small. "I suppose we should get an early night." "Actually," I said, reaching into my inner jacket pocket, "I have something for you to sign first." I pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope. My father frowned, putting on his reading glasses. "What is this?" "A loan application." "Leo, I told you, we aren't taking your money." "It's not a loan," I said. I opened the envelope. Inside was a deed of sale and a discharge of mortgage. I pulled out a set of keys, bright silver, and attached to a heavy keychain with the address of their house engraved on a silver tab. I didn't say a word. I simply slid the keys across the polished mahogany table. The sound was a sharp clack slide that seemed to echo through the entire restaurant. The keys stopped right in front of my father's trembling hand. "What is this?" he whispered. "The house," I said. "I bought it, cash, every square inch of the dirt, the roof, and the garden you love, Mom," my mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Leo ... how you said you were just a consultant?" I lied, I said, and for the first time I let the confidence I'd been suppressed for 5 years flood into my voice. "I didn't want you to worry about me, but more importantly, I didn't want you to protect me into a life I didn't want. You said I'd never afford a house in this lifetime. You were right about one thing. I couldn't afford the life you wanted for me, so I built my own." My father picked up the keys. He held them as if they were made of ancient, fragile glass. He looked at the deed, seeing my name, his name as the sole owner, and then the legal transfer granting them a life estate. You bought it for us? My mother sobbed, the tears finally breaking through. But you ... your car ... your clothes ... The car works, the clothes are comfortable, I said. But the look on your faces right now, that's the only luxury I ever really wanted. The aftermath. The silence that followed wasn't the heavy, humid silence of the kitchen. It was a clear, ringing silence. The power dynamic that had defined our lives for 29 years had shifted in a single heartbeat. My father looked up from the keys. His eyes were wet, but the hardness, the defensive, bitter shell he'd worn like armor, was gone. I called you a dreamer, he said, his voice thick. I thought I was helping you by keeping your feet on the ground. You did, Dad, I replied. You kept them so close to the ground that I decided I had to own the ground just to feel like I was standing up. He nodded slowly. It was the first time in my life he had ever looked at me and seen a man instead of a risk. He reached out and put his hand over mine, not a squeeze of consolation, but a grip of genuine, humbled respect. We walked out of the restaurant together. I drove them back to the house that was no longer a rental, no longer a source of anxiety, but a fortress. As they climbed out of my beat-up car, my mother stopped and looked at the front door. Will you come in? She asked. For a tea, a real one? No, I said, smiling. I have a meeting in the morning. I'm closing on a second property downtown, my own place. It has a view of the water. You'll have to come over next Sunday. I watched them walk up the driveway. My father was walking a little taller. My mother was already talking about where she'd plant the new rose bushes now that no landlord could tell her no. I pulled away from the curb, the engine of my old car rattling. It was a beautiful sound. I had played the long game. I had endured the no's and the nevers. And as I looked in the rearview mirror at the house I now owned, I realized that the best part of the revenge wasn't the keys or the money. It was the fact that I no longer needed their permission to be successful. The new reality, a month later, the boxes were unpacked. The porcelain birds were back on the mantle. I arrived for Sunday dinner, but things were different. The Earl Grey didn't smell like disappointment anymore. It smelled like home. My father was in the backyard, fixing a fence he had ignored for a decade because why improve someone else's property? He saw me and waved a hammer. Leo, come look at this. I'm thinking of putting a deck in. What do you think? Can we get a permit for that? I'll handle the permits, Dad, leaning against the doorframe. My mother came up behind me, handing me a glass of cold lemonade. She didn't talk about Marcus the mailman. She didn't talk about realistic goals. She just looked at me with a quiet, shimmering pride that felt warmer than the summer sun. I'm sorry we didn't believe you, she whispered. Don't be, I said, taking a sip of the drink. If you had believed me, I might have gotten comfortable, and comfort is the enemy of the keys. I stayed for dinner. We sat at the same wooden table. But this time, when we talked about the future, nobody mentioned the word never. The table was the same, but the world was entirely new. I had proven them wrong, but in doing so, I had given them the greatest gift possible. The realization that their son was exactly the man they were afraid he'd never be. As I drove back to my penthouse that night, the city lights reflecting off the hood of my car, I felt the weight of the keys in my own pocket. They were heavy, they were real, and they were mine.